My parents told everyone they funded my life. I released the documents showing I paid their mortgage for 12 years. The email came to me through a mutual friend, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Why would my mother send me a message about a family event through someone else's email account? Why not just call me directly? But I read it anyway, sitting in my office on a Tuesday morning, coffee growing cold in my mug as I scrolled through the words that would eventually upend everything I thought I understood about my relationship with my parents. The email was an invitation to a charity gala, the kind of black tie event my parents had started attending with increasing frequency over the past few years. They'd always been social people, but as they moved into their 60s, they'd become more involved in charitable organizations, more visible in community events, more present in the social circles that mattered in our city. But there was a note attached to the invitation from my mother. "Darling, we're so excited about this event. It's being held to celebrate the work of the Children's Foundation, and they asked if we'd be willing to sponsor the evening. We've been discussing it, and we wanted to say yes. Your father and I have been so blessed in our lives, and we want to give back. We're going to be honored at the gala as community benefactors for our generosity and support of local youth initiatives. We'd love for you to be there to celebrate with us." I read it 3 times, trying to figure out what was bothering me about the message. On the surface, it was lovely, my parents being generous, giving back to the community, being recognized for their philanthropy. What was there to object to? But then I realized what was bugging me. The framing. We've been so blessed in our lives. We want to give back. The implicit message was clear. My parents, through their own hard work and smart financial management, had built a comfortable life and now wanted to share their success. That was the story they were telling. And from what I could gather from the email being forwarded through a mutual friend, it was also the story they were telling to other people in their social circle. I didn't respond to the invitation. I didn't call my mother to congratulate them. Instead, I did something that would have consequences I couldn't have predicted. I started looking through my own financial records. I'm an accountant by training and profession, so I keep meticulous records. Every bank statement, every receipt, every financial transaction is documented somewhere in my filing system. What I was looking for, specifically, were records of payments I'd made to my parents' mortgage account over the years. I didn't remember making these payments. That sounds odd to say now, but there's a reason for that. The payments had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, over such a long period of time that they'd become part of the fabric of my financial life. I'd stopped thinking of them as discrete events and started thinking of them as obligations, the way you think about paying rent or paying for electricity. But when I pulled the records together and started calculating, the numbers were staggering. My parents' home, the house I'd grown up in, the place where my childhood memories lived, had a mortgage. When I was 23 years old and freshly graduated from college with a degree in accounting and a decent entry-level job, my mother had asked me if I could help them out temporarily. Their mortgage payments were higher than expected, and they were going through a rough financial period. "Just until we get back on our feet," she said. "Maybe 6 months? A year at most." I was young and naive and still operating under the assumption that parents were fundamentally stable, reliable figures who knew how to manage their own lives. So I said yes, and I sent them $500 that month to help with their mortgage. $500 seemed like a reasonable amount at the time. I could afford it. I had a decent salary, no dependents, no major expenses beyond rent and food. It seemed like the right thing to do. 1 month became 2. 2 became 6. 6 became a year, and then another year, and then another. And somewhere in that process, the temporary help became permanent. The amount increased as my salary increased. By the time I was 30, I was sending my parents $2,000 every month to cover their mortgage payment. I knew about these payments, of course. I made them deliberately. But what I didn't know was how my parents were representing this arrangement to the rest of the world. I didn't know that they were telling people they were helping to fund my life. I didn't know that they were saying things like, "We're so grateful to have been able to support our child through the early years of their career." I didn't know that they were positioning themselves as generous benefactors while I was, in fact, the one being generous. Sitting at my desk with 12 years of mortgage payment records in front of me, I started doing the math. $24,000 per year. 12 years. That meant I'd paid approximately $288,000 directly toward my parents' mortgage. But it wasn't just the mortgage payments. There were other things too. Money I'd given them for property taxes when they fell behind. Money for insurance. Money for home repairs. A new roof in year 3. Foundation work in year 7. Replacing the HVAC system in year 10. When I added all of it together, when I compiled every single payment I'd made to support my parents' home and their lifestyle, the number was staggering. $412,000. $412,000. Over 12 years. From me to them. And they were out there telling people they'd funded my life. I sat back in my chair, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was anger underneath it. It was a kind of disorientation, like I'd been living in one reality and suddenly discovered I'd been living in another the entire time. I thought about all the times my mother had said to me, "We're so glad we could help you get started." I thought about the times my father had mentioned to family friends that they'd supported me through my early career. I thought about the dozens of conversations where my parents had positioned themselves as the givers and me as the receiver. None of it was true. Or rather, it was the opposite of true. I'd been giving them money every single month for 12 years. And they'd been accepting that money while telling the world that I should be grateful for their support. The gala was in 4 weeks. I knew my parents would be there, wearing nice clothes, accepting congratulations on their generosity and their success. I knew they would tell the story of how blessed they'd been to be able to support their child through those early years of financial struggle. I knew other parents would hear that story and either nod with recognition or feel a little guilty about their own inability to do the same for their children. And I couldn't let that happen. I didn't decide this rationally. I didn't sit down and weigh the pros and cons of going public with the truth. What I did was act from a place of hurt and betrayal and accumulated resentment. I compiled a document. Every single payment I'd made to my parents, organized chronologically, with bank statements attached as evidence. Every mortgage payment, every property tax, every repair bill. I organized it clearly, with a summary at the top. Total financial support provided by me to parents between 2010 to 2022 for $112,000. Then I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but which I can't say I regret. I posted it on social media. I didn't rant. I didn't attack my parents or call them liars or demand gratitude. I simply posted an image of the summary and wrote a caption that was brief and factual. In light of the rumors circulating that my parents funded my early career, I want to be clear about the actual financial relationship we've had. For the past 12 years, I've paid my parents' mortgage, property taxes, and home repairs, totaling approximately $412,000. I did this willingly, out of love and a desire to help them maintain their home. However, I can't remain silent while they receive praise for supporting me financially. The truth is the opposite. This isn't about being ungrateful, it's about correcting a false narrative. I hit post at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and then I immediately regretted it. But it was too late to take it back. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My post went viral within hours, shared by friends, commented on by strangers, dissected and discussed across multiple platforms. The internet loves a good family drama, especially one that involves financial betrayal and the violation of unspoken agreements. But the internet's response was the least of my problems. The real fallout came from my family. My mother called me at 6 a.m, her voice shaking with rage. "How could you?" she said without preamble. "How could you publicly humiliate us like that? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I told the truth. I said, but I could hear how weak that sounded. "You told your version of the truth," she snapped. "And you did it in the cruelest possible way. We are your parents. We gave you life. And this is how you repay us." "I repaid you by paying your mortgage for 12 years, I said, and I could feel the anger rising in my own voice now. What I couldn't repay was the dishonesty. The fact that you were out there telling people you funded my life while I was literally funding your home. "We did support you," my mother said. "We raised you. We paid for your education." "Which you've reminded me of approximately 10,000 times, I interrupted. "But Mom, I repaid that too. By paying for your mortgage." That was the exchange. I paid you back and we were even. But then you started lying about it. There was silence on the other end of the line. The gala is in 3 weeks, my mother said finally, her voice small and defeated. The Children's Foundation is expecting us. We're supposed to be honored. And now everyone is going to be talking about your post instead of celebrating what we're trying to do. And that was the moment I understood the depth of my parents' self-deception. They genuinely didn't see themselves as having done anything wrong. They genuinely believed that I owed them gratitude and silence. They genuinely thought that their image and their reputation were more important than being honest about the financial relationship we actually had. My father called later that day. He was calmer than my mother, but the disappointment in his voice was somehow worse. "We taught you better than this," he said. "Family business stays private. You don't air dirty laundry on the internet for the world to see." "What dirty laundry?" I asked. "I paid my debt. I paid your mortgage. That's not dirty laundry. That's just facts." "The facts are irrelevant," my father said. "What matters is that you embarrassed us publicly. That you made us look bad. And for what? So you could be right? So you could prove some point about who supported whom. So I could correct a lie," I said quietly. "That's what matters to me." But I could tell my father didn't understand. In his worldview, maintaining family harmony and protecting the family's reputation was more important than truth. And my refusal to do that made me, in his eyes, a traitor. My sister called me the next day, and I braced myself for more judgment. But instead, she was crying. "Thank you," she said, which caught me completely off guard. "For what?" I asked. "For telling the truth," she said. "Do you know how much Mom and Dad have been saying that they've supported me financially? Do you know how guilty that's made me feel? I thought I was the ungrateful one, the one who didn't appreciate everything they'd done for me. And all this time, they were the ones lying about the relationship." My sister, Sarah, was 32 years old, married with 2 kids, and working as a teacher. She and I had never been particularly close. There was a 5-year age gap, different friend groups, different trajectories. But hearing her voice break as she talked about the guilt my parents had made her feel, I realized that their dishonesty extended beyond me. "They told my husband that I'm irresponsible with money," Sarah said. "That they've always had to help us out. But they've never helped us with anything. We've never asked them for money. Yet somehow, my husband started believing that we were somehow indebted to them, that we had to invite them to everything and listen to their advice on how we should be raising our kids, because they've done so much for us." "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't apologize," Sarah said. "You did the right thing. I've been trying to figure out how to set boundaries with them for years, and you just made that possible. Now, when they say they've supported us financially, I can point to the actual truth. I can say, no, actually my sibling paid your mortgage while we've never taken a dollar from you." My uncle called me next. He was my father's brother, and he wanted to tell me that my post had caused a lot of damage in the family. Apparently, my father and mother had called an emergency family meeting and presented their version of events to various relatives, positioning me as an ungrateful, money-obsessed person who is willing to humiliate his parents for the sake of internet points. "Your father is devastated," my uncle said. "He feels like he raised a child who doesn't respect him." "Does he respect the truth?" I asked. "That's not the point," my uncle said. But to me, it was exactly the point. As the days went on, my post continued to generate attention. Local news outlets picked up the story. There were articles about family financial lies and the cost of parental dishonesty. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to me with their own stories of financial entanglement with their parents, of feeling guilty for years about imaginary debts they supposedly owed. But the attention also forced me to be more precise about my claims. If I was going to make these accusations public, I needed to be absolutely certain about the facts. So I went through my records more carefully, cross-referencing bank statements with mortgage documents, creating a comprehensive timeline of payments and amounts. What I found was even more detailed than my initial calculation. I created a spreadsheet that showed, month by month, every payment I'd made to my parents' mortgage. I showed the dates of property tax payments I'd made directly to the county. I showed the checks I'd written for home repairs, with photos of the receipts. I also did something else. I calculated what my parents would have had to do if I hadn't been paying their mortgage. With a quick consultation with a financial planner friend, I determined that they would have had to downsize their home, sell the property, or significantly reduce their spending on other things. The monthly mortgage payment was approximately $2,000, the exact amount I'd been sending them for the past 12 years. In essence, I had been paying to keep them in their home. Without my payments, their lifestyle would have been fundamentally different. I created a more comprehensive document and shared it with my immediate family, my parents, my sister, and my uncle. I sent it to them with a letter that explained, without anger or accusation, what the documents showed and why I had felt compelled to share the truth publicly. The letter said, in part, "I understand that my post was hurtful and embarrassing. I understand that you felt blindsided and that your reputation was affected. But I also need you to understand why I felt I had no choice. For 12 years, I sent you money every month. I did this because I love you and because I didn't want you to lose your home. I never asked for acknowledgement or gratitude. But when you started telling people, my friends, your social circles, and implicitly me, that you had funded my life, I couldn't stay silent. That wasn't just factually incorrect, it was a reversal of reality that was affecting how people understood my character and my gratitude. I'm not asking you to apologize, but I am asking you to acknowledge the truth of what happened between us. Not for my sake, but for yours. Because continuing to tell a false story is the thing that will actually damage your reputation, not the truth getting out." My parents asked to meet me in person. We arranged to meet at a restaurant neutral territory, like we were business partners negotiating a deal rather than family trying to work through conflict. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. That sounds strange, but I'm not sure how else to describe it. My last memory of her had been in social settings where she was confident and put together. Now, across from me in a quiet booth at a restaurant we used to go to when I was a child, she looked diminished somehow. My father was quieter than usual. He ordered coffee but didn't drink it, just stared into the cup like he was looking for answers at the bottom. "I want to understand what we did wrong," my mother said finally. "I want to understand where we lost you." "You didn't lose me," I said. "But you did lie to me and about me. That's what I need you to acknowledge." "We didn't think of it as lying," my father said, and he actually seemed to mean it. "We thought of it as how you frame your life, how you tell the story of yourself." "That's called lying," I said, not unkindly. "When you tell a story that's factually incorrect, that's lying." "But from our perspective," my mother said carefully, "we did support you. We raised you. We gave you the foundation to become successful. The money was just one manifestation of that support." "That's a fair point," I acknowledged. "You did raise me. You did provide me with an education and a foundation. And I was grateful for that. But gratitude isn't the same as owing you money. And I paid the money anyway, to help you keep your home. So we were even." "We didn't think about it in terms of being even," my father said. "We thought about it in terms of family. You needed help and we helped you." "No," I said, and I felt my frustration rising again. "That's not what happened. I offered to help you, and you accepted. And then you told people that you'd help me. That's the part that's the problem." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I've been telling that story for so long," she said. "That you were our struggling child, and we were the supportive parents. It became part of how I understood myself. And now you're telling me that story is wrong." And in that moment, I felt something shift. I realized that my parents weren't being deliberately dishonest out of malice. They'd constructed a narrative that made sense to them, that made them feel like good parents, that positioned them in a role they could understand and be proud of. And that narrative had become so real to them that they'd forgotten where the truth ended and the story began. "I'm not trying to punish you," I said quietly. "I'm trying to get you to see the actual truth of what happened between us." "We see it now," my father said. "We see it because you made us see it. And we're ashamed." That admission, those few words, opened something up. We sat in that restaurant for 2 more hours, and we talked about the money, about the expectations, about the ways that financial entanglement had distorted our relationship. My parents talked about why they needed the help in the first place. My father had struggled with gambling for a period, losing money that had put their mortgage in jeopardy. That was the original crisis that had led to my mother asking me for help. But over time, they'd rebuilt their finances and eventually didn't need my help anymore, except they never told me to stop sending the money, so I didn't. "We should have stopped you," my mother said. "When we got back on our feet, we should have said, 'You don't need to help us anymore.' But we didn't. We accepted your money because it was easier than not accepting it." And there it was. The real truth. Not that they were evil or deliberately deceitful, but that they were human. They were people who had made mistakes, who had accepted help when they needed it, and then continued accepting it when they didn't, partly out of inertia, and partly because it enhanced their image as people with a successful, involved child. 2 weeks later, my parents did something unexpected. They issued a public statement. It wasn't a full retraction. They maintained their privacy about the details, but it was an acknowledgement. The statement read, "We want to address recent discussions about our family's financial history. Upon reflection, we realize that we have not been entirely accurate in describing our relationship with our child. While we are proud of the role we played in raising and educating our child, we also want to acknowledge that we received significant financial support during a difficult period in our lives. We are grateful for that support, and we regret that we did not acknowledge it publicly sooner. We also regret that our descriptions of the financial relationship may have created a false impression about our child's character or level of indebtedness to us. We are committed to being more honest and accurate in how we discuss our family relationships going forward." It wasn't everything I wanted them to say. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of the $412,000 or the 12 years of mortgage payments. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement that they had misrepresented things. More importantly, they sent me a letter. A private letter, not for public consumption, in which they apologized directly to me. "We're sorry," the letter said. "We're sorry for the ways we've misrepresented our relationship. We're sorry for accepting your help and then telling a different story about it. We're sorry for making you feel that you had to publicly shame us to make us listen. We love you, and we're working on being more honest people." It was signed by both of them, in their handwriting, not typed. My parents did attend the gala, despite everything. The Children's Foundation honored them as planned. But the tone of the evening was different than they'd originally envisioned. A few people had seen my post and my parents' subsequent statement. There was some awkwardness. Some people who had originally congratulated them on their generosity now felt uncomfortable, wondering if that generosity had been earned or if they'd been lied to. But something unexpected happened too. Some people approached my parents and told them that they appreciated their honesty and willingness to acknowledge their mistakes. In a world where people are constantly performing and presenting curated versions of themselves, there is something refreshing about seeing people admit that they'd gotten things wrong. My mother called me after the gala. "I thought it would be horrible," she said. "I thought everyone would judge us, would think less of us for what you revealed. But mostly they were kind. Mostly they understood that we're all just doing the best we can, and sometimes we mess up." "That's good," I said. "I'm glad it wasn't as bad as you feared." "I've been thinking about something," she said. "I've been thinking about how much of my life I've spent worrying about what people think of me, and how that worry made me dishonest in ways I didn't even realize. How I created narratives about myself that felt safer than the truth, and then defended those narratives so fiercely that I actually started to believe them." "That's very self-aware," I said. "Your father and I are going to a therapist," she said. "Together and separately. We want to understand what happened here, and we want to be better." Healing from that situation wasn't quick or easy. My relationship with my parents remained strained for a long time after the gala. We saw each other for holidays, but there was a guardedness that hadn't been there before. They'd hurt me by lying about me, and I'd hurt them by exposing those lies publicly. But we started a process of rebuilding slowly. My mother and I began having monthly dinners, just the two of us. These weren't heavy or confrontational. We talked about books we were reading, movies we'd seen, small things about our daily lives. But underneath those conversations was a foundation of truth. Neither of us was pretending anymore. Neither of us was performing for an audience. My father was slower to warm up. But gradually, he too came around. He started asking me questions about my work, about my life, about my plans for the future. And, importantly, he started listening to the answers rather than immediately pivoting to advice or judgment. 6 months after the gala, my father called me on a Saturday morning while I was at the gym. He asked if I could come to their house that afternoon, just for a few hours. When I got there, they had prepared a spreadsheet. It was similar to the one I'd created, but they'd added to it. They'd calculated year by year what they estimated the value of their support to me had been during my childhood and young adulthood, college tuition, room and board, advice, emotional support. They'd also totaled the amount I'd paid for their mortgage and home repairs. We wanted to understand the real accounting of our relationship, my father said. Not to prove that one of us owed the other something, but just to see it clearly in numerical terms. What they'd calculated was that the support they'd given me early in my life and the support I'd given them later in my life were roughly equal. Not exact, there was probably no way to truly quantify emotional support or parental love in financial terms, but roughly equivalent. We wanted you to know that we see you now, my mother said. We see what you did for us. We see that you were generous. And we're grateful. And we all cried a little bit because sometimes that's what it takes for families to actually connect, seeing each other clearly, without the distortion of narrative or expectation or shame. A year after my post went viral, my parents and I had rebuilt something real. It wasn't the same as what we'd had before. That version had been built on a lie, so it couldn't be restored as is. But it was something better in many ways, because it was built on truth. My father started attending my professional development workshops. My mother became genuinely interested in my work rather than just politely asking about it. They invited my sister and me over for regular family dinners, and during these dinners, they were honest about their lives, their struggles, their financial situation. It turned out that their struggles had never really ended. They'd recovered from the gambling crisis that had prompted my initial help, but they were living paycheck to paycheck in many ways, just at a higher income level. The mortgage payment I'd been making wasn't a sign of generosity on their part. It was a necessity that they'd learned to depend on. I continued to help them, but now it was explicit and negotiated. I said, I can contribute $500 a month toward your mortgage, but I need you to tell me honestly if that's enough or if you need something different. And they told me the truth. My mother eventually entered therapy to address some of the shame she felt about the entire situation. She worked through why she'd felt the need to construct a false narrative in the first place. She discovered that her own mother had been hypercritical and that she'd spent her entire life trying to present herself as a perfect parent who had everything under control. Admitting that she'd struggled, that she'd accepted financial help from her child, felt like a failure that she couldn't publicly acknowledge. But with therapy, she learned to separate her self-worth from her image. She learned that being honest about struggles didn't make her a bad parent. In fact, it made her more real, more relatable, and ultimately, more respected by the people around her. My father never fully embraced therapy the way my mother did, but he did start to change. He became less focused on what other people thought, and more focused on being honest about who he was and what he'd done. He apologized to my sister for the things he'd said and implied about her financial responsibility. He admitted that his encouragement for my parents to be involved in her parenting decisions came from a place of insecurity about his own role and relevance. My post about my parents' dishonesty had gotten hundreds of thousands of shares. It had been discussed in articles about family finances, about generational wealth and debt, about how money becomes entangled with shame and narrative. Some people used it as a teaching moment, a warning about the importance of being clear and honest about financial arrangements with family. Others used it as a moment of recognition, seeing themselves in my story, in my parents' story, understanding that they too had created narratives about their family relationships that weren't entirely true. I received messages from people all over the world telling me that my post had prompted them to have difficult conversations with their own parents, to establish clearer boundaries, to demand honesty in their family relationships. What's interesting is that I'm not actually proud of the way I handled it initially. I'm not proud of posting that information publicly, of using social media as a weapon to force my parents into a confrontation. There were better ways I could have handled it, conversations I could have had, boundaries I could have set, demands for honesty that I could have made in private before exposing everything to the world. But I also can't deny that the public post is what made my parents actually listen. My mother later told me that if I'd asked for a private conversation about their dishonesty, they probably would have denied it, defended themselves, and eventually forgotten about the conversation. The public exposure forced them to confront the reality in a way that private conversation probably never would have. So, I'm conflicted about my own actions. I don't think I was wrong, but I also don't think I was entirely right. What the whole situation taught me was that money and family are almost always entangled in ways that are difficult to parse. When I was paying my parents' mortgage, I wasn't just paying a bill. I was expressing love. I was proving my worth as a son. I was trying to repair a home that felt broken due to my father's gambling problem. I was a lot of things all at once. And my parents, when they accepted that money while telling people I was the dependent one, weren't just being dishonest. They were managing their own shame. They were trying to maintain an image of being capable and successful parents. They were protecting themselves from the painful reality that they'd failed in some ways and needed help from their child. These aren't excuses for dishonesty, but they are explanations for how people end up being dishonest, through the accumulation of small compromises, through the telling of stories that feel safe, through the fear of being seen clearly. I started seeing a therapist too, to process my own feelings about the situation. I wanted to understand why I'd felt so compelled to expose my parents publicly, why I hadn't been able to let the issue rest. What I discovered was that I'd been carrying a lot of resentment, not just about the money, though that was part of it, but about feeling invisible, about spending 12 years helping my parents without that help being acknowledged or appreciated, about being told a story about myself, that I was dependent, that I owed them gratitude for supporting me, that contradicted what I knew to be true about my own life. The public post had been my way of forcing people to see the truth about me, to correct the narrative, to demand acknowledgement. And it had worked, but it had also caused a lot of collateral damage. 2 years after my post, life had mostly returned to normal, except it wasn't normal, it was different and in many ways better. My relationship with my parents was deeper than it had ever been. We saw each other regularly. We talked about real things. We maintained appropriate boundaries, and we were honest about financial arrangements and expectations. My sister and I became closer too. She was grateful that my post had given her permission to be honest with our parents about the way they'd made her feel, and to establish clearer boundaries about their involvement in her life. My career continued to progress. I got promoted, moved to a larger company, and eventually became a financial advisor specializing in helping families navigate money and relationships. I used the lessons from my own situation to help other people have the difficult conversations they need to have with their families about money, about obligations, about truth. One of the things I tell people is that money is never really about money. It's about love, about security, about power, about how we understand our own worth and our relationships to other people. And I tell them that honesty is the only foundation that actually works for family relationships. You can build on top of dysfunction for a while, but eventually the cracks will show and the whole structure will need to be rebuilt. My parents eventually paid me back for a portion of the mortgage payments I'd made, not all of them, but about 40%. They did this without me asking, once they were in a better financial position, and once they'd done enough emotional work to want to acknowledge their debt to me. They also commissioned a family therapist to do a series of sessions with us, all 3 of us together, plus my sister, specifically about money and family dynamics. These sessions were hard but ultimately healing. My mother said something in one of these sessions that stuck with me. I spent so much energy trying to make our family look good from the outside that I forgot to actually make it good on the inside. And when I finally stopped performing and started being honest, everything got better. Standing back and looking at the entire situation now, I can see both where I went right and where I went wrong. I was right to stop tolerating dishonesty. I was right to demand that my parents acknowledge the reality of what had happened between us. I was right to set boundaries and to insist on being treated with integrity. But I was wrong to post the information on social media. I was wrong to use public shaming as my tool for enforcing honesty. There were better ways, harder ways, more private ways that would have accomplished the same thing without the collateral damage. What I understand now is that sometimes the most effective thing you can do is have a difficult conversation privately with people who matter to you and be willing to walk away if they refuse to listen. That's actually harder than posting publicly and letting the internet do the forcing for you. But I also understand that sometimes, when private conversations haven't worked for years, when people are firmly entrenched in their narrative and refuse to question it, public exposure can be the only way to crack through that denial. I don't have a clean conclusion to offer, no moral of the story that wraps everything up neatly. What I have instead is a complicated, human situation in which multiple people made mistakes and did the hard work of confronting those mistakes and rebuilding. The bills came due, not in the legal sense, but in the relational sense. My parents finally acknowledged what they'd allowed to happen between us, and I finally allowed myself to forgive them, not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. 3 years after my post, my parents invited me to a dinner party. They were hosting a small gathering of friends, nothing fancy, just people from their community, people they'd come to know well over the years. As I was helping my mother set the table, she said something that made me pause. "I've stopped telling the story about how we supported you," she said. "But I want you to know that I've started telling a different story." "What story?" I asked. "I tell people about how you helped us, about how you paid our mortgage when we needed it. And I tell them that it taught me something important, that generosity and love don't flow in just one direction. That children take care of parents, and parents take care of children, and sometimes the timeline overlaps in ways that nobody expected." "How do people respond to that?" I asked. "Usually with honesty," she said. "Usually with their own stories about ways that family has been complicated or surprising or different from what they expected. It turns out that most people have these kinds of stories. They just don't tell them because everyone's so busy pretending that everything is perfect." That dinner party was actually lovely. Multiple people shared stories about their own family finances, about money given and received, about expectations and reality, about the ways that money becomes entangled with love and obligation. One woman talked about the mortgage payments she'd made to help her aging parents after her father's medical crisis. A man talked about how his adult children had helped him through a business failure and how accepting that help had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but how it had ultimately brought them closer together. By the end of the evening, what had been individual stories of shame and secrecy had become a broader conversation about the universal nature of family financial complexity. That's when I realized that the real value of my post hadn't been in shaming my parents or forcing them to be honest. The real value had been in opening up a conversation that needed to be opened, in showing that families could survive financial dishonesty if they were willing to confront it and work through it. 5 years after that gala that my parents never quite got to celebrate the way they'd planned, life had settled into a new normal that was, in many ways, far better than the old one. My parents and I had quarterly financial reviews where we discussed their situation and my ability to help. This had become a straightforward, business-like conversation rather than an emotional minefield. They were honest about their needs. I was honest about my boundaries. And we worked together to find solutions. My sister and I had conversations about our parents' situation and made a conscious decision together to support them without enabling them. This meant being helpful without allowing them to become entirely dependent. It meant being honest about what we could and couldn't do. My mother had stopped performing. I could see it in the way she moved through the world, with a kind of ease that hadn't been there before. She was no longer exhausting herself by maintaining a perfect image. She was just herself. My father took longer to get there, but he eventually did. He started being more authentic in his relationships, more willing to admit weakness or mistake, more genuinely present with the people he cared about. What I learned from the entire situation is that dishonesty in families usually comes from a place of fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of being inadequate. Fear of losing status or respect. And that the only way through that fear is to face it head-on and decide that being authentic is more important than being perfect. I also learned that posting things on social media out of anger is almost never the best approach, even when the core message is true. There are usually better ways to have the conversations you need to have. But I also learned that sometimes people won't listen unless they're forced to listen, and there's a difference between being forced and being destroyed. My parents weren't destroyed by my post. Their reputation took a hit, but they survived it. And more importantly, they grew from it. They became better people, better parents, better members of their community because they were finally honest about who they actually were. My parents are in their 70s now. They've retired from their jobs and are living a more modest lifestyle than before, but they're living honestly. They talk openly about their financial situation with friends. They volunteer for the same children's foundation that was supposed to honor them years ago. They've become known in their community not for being generous donors, but for being honest, real people who are willing to acknowledge their struggles and limitations. My mother has become a mentor to younger women who are struggling with perfectionism and the exhaustion of maintaining an image. She tells them about how she spent decades trying to appear successful and put together, and how that performative perfection nearly cost her her relationship with her children. My father has become involved in a support group for people dealing with addiction and financial problems related to that addiction. He uses his own experience with gambling to help other people navigate the shame and the lies that often accompany addiction. In a strange way, the entire situation, my post, the fallout, the confrontation, the reconciliation, became a catalyst for them to become the kind of people they'd always wanted to be, just in a more authentic way. And me? I stopped thinking about the money at some point. The $412,000 I'd paid toward their mortgage stopped feeling like a debt owed to me or a sacrifice I'd made. It started feeling like just something I'd done because I loved them and because it had been within my power to help. That's not to say I don't think about the dishonesty. I do. It's part of our family story now. But it's a story about how we moved from dishonesty to authenticity, from performance to presence, from fear to acceptance. I still work as a financial advisor, and I still tell clients the story of my family situation. Not to shame my parents, but to illustrate a principle, that financial honesty is the foundation for healthy family relationships, and that it's never too late to rebuild on a foundation of truth. My sister tells me that my parents have become better grandparents since all of this happened. More present, less focused on projecting an image of the perfect family, and more focused on actually being in relationship with her kids. That feels like the kind of victory that actually matters. The viral post has mostly faded from the internet now. It gets shared occasionally, still, usually by people going through their own family financial disputes who want to feel less alone. I always feel a little complicated when it gets reshared, proud that it helped people, but also aware that it wasn't the highest version of how I could have handled things. But I've made peace with that. I handled a situation imperfectly, out of hurt and frustration, but it ultimately led to something healing and real. Sometimes that's the best you can do. Sometimes messy truth is better than perfect lies. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for the people you love is force them to see themselves clearly, even if that means they hate you for it, at least temporarily. My parents and I have a joke now. Every year on the anniversary of my post, my father sends me a text that says, "Still not going to post any more financial documents, I hope?" And I respond, "Only if you go back to lying about funding my life." And then we both laugh because we've earned the right to laugh about it. That laughter means more to me than any amount of money ever could.